Amen. I understand that it would be normal to have notes in a class of this style, and I've decided to not print notes because I don't believe they would be that useful to you. I'm happy to notify of my sources and I'm happy to send all my notes if people request them. But really, for some of this history, it's been a little bit like wading through knee-deep mud to try and find relevant points in those paragraphs. And I haven't wanted people to have to do that and get bogged down with details of other kings, other unrelated events, or the personal opinions of the authors. So if you want to look at A.T. Jones, he provides a very good framework for the life of Pyrrhus. There are details he misses where other sources have been necessary. But I've tried to be able to lay this line out as concisely, as simply as possible, without really adding unnecessary confusion. So I want to just do a bit of revision. I know that we covered a lot of history yesterday. So we will go over this line just telling it like a story in a moment. One thing that I want to note is that as we've seen from 273 BC and understanding that war, that this is a battle between the north and the south, the king of the north and the king of the south. Understanding that Pyrrhus in that Pyrrhic war played the role of the king of the south. His name Pyrrhus comes from the prefix pyro, and that's probably a word you'll recognise. Pyro meaning fire, high temperature, etc., used in the formation of compound words such as pyromaniac, pyrotechnics, pyrogen, etc., all relating to fire or temperature, heat. Pyrrhus particularly, though, his name means flame red, and it's referencing that colour, the red colour that you associate with fire or burning embers, so it's that colour of fire. Pyrrhus was born 4 years after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC into a very turbulent time in world history, those 22 years that span 4 Diadochi Wars. Those 4 Diadochi Wars are what broke down Alexander the Great's empire from dozens of generals down to the 4 ones that we know are the 4 horns of Daniel chapter 8. The line we've marked really is marking Pyrrhus's, not his birth, but his entrance onto the world scene, into the world politics of that time. So where he enters these global turbulent times is in 303 BC, and this is in the middle of the 4th Diadochi War. In the 3rd and the 4th Diadochi War, you have our 4 famous generals united against a common enemy, Antigonus, known as Antigonus Monothalmus, Antigonus the one-eyed, because he would wear an eye patch, he only had one eye. He was supported in battle by his son Demetrius, and Demetrius was in an alliance with Pyrrhus by marriage. So in 307 BC, Demetrius frees Athens from a dictator placed by Cassander. This broke the peace treaty that ended the 3rd Diadochi War and began the 4th. Pyrrhus and Demetrius go into an alliance in 303. In 301 BC, this alliance is useful when Pyrrhus backs Demetrius at the famous Battle of Ipsus. Cassander, Lysimachus and Seleucus, turning up just in time with approximately 400 war elephants that he'd brought from the east, fight against Antigonus, Demetrius and Pyrrhus. And our 3 allies are victorious in this battle. But for Demetrius, who is really the main character I'm wanting to pick up in this story other than Pyrrhus, for him it's not such great a loss, because with the death of his father, he ascends to the throne, he becomes king, he has his own navy, his own territory to fall back on, and within a fairly short space of time, he's built up an empire that rivals that of his father's. Pyrrhus in this battle undefeated but has to retreat when Antigonus is killed. We covered a little of this history in here that isn't really written down, the division of Macedonia. That occurred because of the death of Cassander, who left it to his eldest son who died. Then you had two younger brothers fighting for the kingdom. And out of that struggle, which both Pyrrhus and Demetrius got involved in, Pyrrhus fairly valiantly just took his piece of territory and placed one brother on the throne. Demetrius, though, as appears to be his character, just killed that brother and took the throne of Macedonia. So in this jumble of politics, they both take Macedonia and divide it between them. So you have a division of territory. This put a huge strain on their alliance. By 291 BC, this division has occurred. Pyrrhus' sister, who married Demetrius, has died. What I didn't mention yesterday is Pyrrhus' wife, Lanassa. She married Pyrrhus and brought with her some territory, particularly some islands located just off from Epirus in that marriage. And the story is told that she came from a background where polygamy wasn't accepted and Pyrrhus didn't. So she saw him as being unfaithful to her when he started marrying multiple wives. So in 291 BC, she picks up her territories, writes to Demetrius and says, "Why don't I marry you instead?" So she leaves her husband Pyrrhus for Demetrius, taking her territory with her. So that naturally doesn't really go over well between the two supposed allies. So in 291, Demetrius is besieging a city down here in Greece, and Pyrrhus starts to make trouble. He comes down here and invades Thessaly, which is also part of Demetrius' empire, him having built an empire that spanned this region. And what he's doing is cutting Demetrius off in Greece from his holdings in Macedonia. He's quickly expelled. I don't believe they ever fight a battle, but when Demetrius comes up to face him, Pyrrhus runs back to Epirus. Demetrius responds to that Pyrrhus kind of started it. Demetrius responds by finishing his siege, which he was victorious in, as always, and marching up through Thessaly, through into Epirus, and just sending his army right up to ravage the territory, which he does very successfully. Again, there is no battle. Pyrrhus misses him somehow, ends up in Thessaly. He does one-on-one combat with the general of Demetrius, and he does in that fight, he is victorious. So this was kind of their first battle. After this, they entered into a peace treaty. Demetrius undertook this huge military build-up that they said was more than what, even in conservative estimates, was a greater military build-up than Alexander the Great had built to try and take over the East. So it's a huge enterprise he's undertaking here. And this concerns the three remaining allies who are still alive: Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. They have years' worth of memories of trying to take down Demetrius' father, and now that he is about as strong as his father and building up this huge army and machines of war, they know that he's going to threaten them very soon. So they go into an alliance with Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus joins them. They come to Macedonia from the east and the west. So Pyrrhus marching from the east, and Lysimachus, Seleucus and Ptolemy don't show up, but Lysimachus marching from the east. So Pyrrhus from the west, Lysimachus from the east diverge onto Macedonia. Demetrius' army abandon him and join either Lysimachus or Pyrrhus. Most of them appear to have joined Pyrrhus. So what you have now is Macedonia divided between east and west, between Lysimachus and between Pyrrhus, Demetrius here being defeated. This sparked a cold war where Lysimachus was not happy just having that eastern portion. Through sanctions, through subterfuge, he turns Pyrrhus's own territories against him, and Pyrrhus loses all but his nation of Epirus that we have marked. Also, at this waymark, we have a change in scene. So, while all of this is going on in Macedonia, over in Italy, Thurii has changed its alliance, really. So, Thurii, located on the western side of the Bay of the Gulf of Taranto, decide to align with Rome, and this was the trouble most of these Greek city-states faced. Is in each city-state there was two factions vying for power. This was the democrats versus the aristocrats. The aristocrats, mainly being driven by wealth, knew that an alliance with Rome would be more beneficial to that. The democrats, more patriotic and being Greeks themselves, wanted to maintain their alliance with Tarentum. Really, it depends which dictator you want and whose sphere of influence you want to come under, whether you would choose Tarentum or Rome. Thurii appealed to Rome twice, 285 and again, I think it was in 283. That second time, Rome sent down a navy and troops stationed a garrison in Thurii, and this broke an old treaty that they had with Tarentum, and it was the last straw for Tarentum. They attacked that navy of 10 ships, sunk 4, captured 1. They then invaded Thurii and expelled the garrison, and this sparked a declaration of war from Rome. They aren't strong enough to wage war themselves against a nation, the nation that Rome had become over the last few years. So they send ambassadors to Epirus and ask Pyrrhus to fight this war on their behalf. Pyrrhus agrees and arrives in Tarentum in 280. Here he marches into the city, stations his own army, and starts to prepare for war. Really, this is internal. He's bringing Tarentum under control. Later that same year, earlier than Pyrrhus was willing already, Rome descends on Tarentum and he's forced into a battle, the Battle of Heraclea in 280. This is the first time Rome has seen elephants, and that's really what wins the battle for Pyrrhus. It's a smaller battle, and now this coming into winter time, they aren't able to continue. So the following spring, they meet at Asculum. They fight a second 2-day battle, twice the size. Rome has now they've prepared 300 anti-elephant carts. That doesn't help their situation, and Pyrrhus wins once again, both time winning but at a great loss to himself, because Rome is just so easily able to replenish their army, having much more resources. Pyrrhus cannot. He goes into a very shaky armistice with Rome and sails down to Sicily, there wanting to rebuild, essentially. He turns himself into a dictator. He desecrates a temple, but it is of no use to him. And Sicily very soon turns against him, and while they asked him to come to free them from Carthage, now they go to Carthage and ask Carthage to free them from Pyrrhus. Carthage was a better master than Pyrrhus had been. Rome again is descending on the south, so Pyrrhus sails back to Italy and meets them in the Battle of Beneventum. Here he loses, and he loses to his own elephants. Again, elephants decide the battle when they turn and charge on his own troops. Pyrrhus loses, heads back to Tarentum, jumps on a ship and flees back to his country of Epirus. We looked at the name Beneventum, what it meant as the Italian Salem. 273 BC, Egypt sends ambassadors to Rome. Egypt has had a lot of contact with Pyrrhus over the years. Pyrrhus's first wife was Ptolemy's stepdaughter. So they've been following this battle, and really it's these three battles, this war with Rome, that makes them take notice of Rome. So they send ambassadors in 273. In 272, Rome sends ambassadors back to Egypt, led by Fabius Maximus Gergus, the Maximum Flood. Pyrrhus dies in the streets of Argos, Argos meaning the white colour of grain at harvest. He is 46 years old, and Tarentum finally surrenders. They've been under siege since 275, a 3-year siege. So you have the completed falling of the south. So we understand from Daniel chapter 2 and that statue, and when Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "Thou art this head of gold," we understand that a kingdom and a king can be used interchangeably. So I've suggested that Pyrrhus is the king of the south. I would suggest that Tarentum represents the king of the south, and depending which line of history we see a change in this history, Pyrrhus also represents the king of the south. So I want to pause our journey through history and have a little look at Pyrrhus and the history of that country. This is where I find Pyrrhus's name interesting, that colour red. If you look at the French Revolution, the colour red became their symbol, and it was used to symbolise the blood of the workers, the rising up of the workers and the blood that they shed. That colour red then came up again in 1848 with the European revolutions, as that revolutionary spirit spread across Europe. And then with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the red flag was seen as a symbol of revolution and then a symbol of communism. If you look at the flag of the Soviet Union, any of their military parades, any of their demonstrations, even what Putin is bringing back, now he has military parades, he's flying the Soviet flag, and everything is the colour red. So if you follow back into the history of Pyrrhus, much like the history of Rome, it descends into the mythological, where they believed they had descended from gods. The first known king that enters that history, the first king that history records, is Admetus in around 500 BC. I'm going to mark him as the first. From Admetus, Pyrrhus is the 10th. The 10th and the most famous king. Pyrrhus was inexperienced and fairly weak when he first came to the throne. So, as a young man, he did something that seems a little bit too modern, and he attended a friend's birthday party outside of his kingdom. While he had left his kingdom unoccupied, a rival faction stepped up and took the throne from him. And that king was Neoptolemus II. What Pyrrhus then did is using his, he used his alliance with Ptolemy to come back into Epirus with a certain amount of strength, and he forced Neoptolemus into a co-rulership. So these two ruled together for a period of time. And they co-rule. Alleging that Neoptolemus was plotting against him, Pyrrhus used that as an excuse to have him killed. And again, he was sole ruler. After Pyrrhus died in 272 BC, there are 7 kings after him. I just want to mark the number 7. And after those 7, Epirus was ruled by what is known as the Epirot League, a league of nations. So in our history, who do you think would be represented by Pyrrhus? King and a kingdom, and who is the king of the south? Vladimir Putin. Who is Putin the 10th from, counting back through the leaders of Russia? Putin is the 10th leader of Russia since Stalin. Putin, though, came to the presidency young, fairly inexperienced, without a long, solid background in politics. He'd only been involved in the politics in Moscow for about 3 or 4 years. So he steps into the presidency not by election, but by Boris Yeltsin's resignation in 1999, end of 1999. In the year 2000, he runs for election and wins. 2004, his first term ends. He runs for election again. He runs a second term. 2008 is the end of his second term, and that is the maximum he's allowed to rule for under the Russian constitution. They're only allowed to run for 2 consecutive terms, the key being consecutive. He can run for a third term, but not consecutively. So he knows 2008 is the end. So what does he do in 2008? He makes a very, very clever move. He names his preferred successor as Dmitry Medvedev on the 10th of December 2007. This took the West by surprise, as they thought Medvedev too modern, too pro-Western to earn Putin's endorsement. They were expecting him to choose someone from his old ranks in the KGB. But Medvedev was successfully elected on the promise that he would make Putin his prime minister. I find the poster for his election absolutely fascinating. You have a photo of Putin and Medvedev standing side by side, and it reads, "Together we win." This was a co-rulership, not even hidden. Medvedev and Putin co-ruled. And if you want to get into body language with that photo, there's 2 men standing side by side, and who's in front? Putin. And who's talking? Putin. Medvedev is sitting in the background, smiling, taking it all in. Medvedev isn't even in the front. Medvedev is faithful, probably because the other options aren't very congenial. And he does not run for a second term. He just runs for the 1 term, which is all Putin needs him to do. In 2011, Putin announces that he's running for a 3rd term, and he steps back in as president. If we're going to mark his death at Sunday law, I'd like to suggest you can mark the number 7, and then his territory is ruled by the Epirot League, a league of nations. So I hope we can see that Pyrrhus can represent Putin. I want to make that, try and lock that down a little more for us if we can, and go back into the history of his father. So I'll just mark down some kings. We have his father, Alcides. Neoptolemus II, in this story it is the same fellow. Alcides again. And then Alcetus II. And I'll just run you through this history. So Alcides involved his people in a war they did not want to be in, and that war was the second of those Diadochi wars. Alcides being a close relative of Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great. As Queen Mother, she became heavily involved in those first 2 Diadochi wars, where her daughter-in-law, her grandchildren, were still alive and pretty much being passed around by the generals as the inheritors of Alexander the Great's kingdom. So she became heavily involved in those wars. Alcides, her being a princess of Epirus, Alcides then came to her aid and involved himself in the Second Diadochi War. His people were tired of fighting. They didn't see the need of leaving their families and their crops to march and get involved in these squabbling generals. So it pretty much, his rule here ended with a popular uprising. The people were tired of this war. So he flees, and Neoptolemus II, a rival family for the throne in Epirus, becomes king for a short period of time. Then the Epirotes, the people of Epirus, return Alcides to the throne. But he is severely weakened because of this affair. Severely weakened. Cassander sends his brother and has him killed. Alcides' brother, Pyrrhus' uncle, Alcetus II, then takes the throne. Alcetus is the elder brother. He's older than Alcides. The reason that he was not the first choice to take the throne back here is he had what you would call as, what the historians have called, whatever they mean by that, but it's repeated by all the sources I can find, was that he had a lack of self-control. All they call it is an ungovernable temper. So Alcides is removed in a coup. Neoptolemus II takes the throne. The rival, Alcides, comes back but weakened. He is killed, and Alcetus II, his elder brother, takes the throne, who had an ungovernable temper. The Epirotes quickly become tired of Alcetus II's behaviour, and they kill him, his own people. So if we trace back a little bit of history from Putin, you have Gorbachev, in 1991 you have the Gang of Eight led by Yanayev. They remove Gorbachev in a coup. And he declares himself, signs a decree making him acting president of the Soviet Union. it's very short, it doesn't last long. That coup ends, it's unsuccessful, and Gorbachev is able to come back. But he is severely weakened by this, also in the eyes of the West. Encyclopedia Britannica says, Gorbachev resumed his duties as Soviet president, but his position had by now been irretrievably weakened. Entering into an unavoidable alliance with Yeltsin, Gorbachev quit the Communist Party, disbanded its Central Committee, and supported measures to strip the party of its control over the KGB and the armed forces. Events outpaced him, however, and the Russian government under Yeltsin readily assumed the functions of the collapsing Soviet government, as the various republics agreed to form a new Commonwealth under Yeltsin's leadership. On December 25 of 1991, Gorbachev resigned the presidency of the Soviet Union, which ceased to exist that same day. I want us to note that when Gorbachev steps down, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. They lowered the Soviet flag and raised the flag of the Russian Federation. And who steps up next? Boris Yeltsin. Because of his behaviour back in the history of this coup, the famous footage of him climbing on a tank, addressing the people, the bravery he showed, the people loved him, but they lost that love very quickly. Why? Complete lack of self-control. He did not keep the respect of the Russian people. His absence from government, his unpredictable public appearances, regularly heavily intoxicated, and the corruption of his government wore the people down. To try and bring stability to his government, he went through 6 different prime ministers in a relatively short period of time, and even for one period acted as his own prime minister. Particularly, I would mark his alcoholism. If you go onto YouTube, there's videos where his bodyguards are literally holding him up as he walks down from a plane, or standing in front of President Clinton. He can't even stand. And this really also affected his health. So it was a lack of self-control, but it was also health reasons. And you'll see why I want to include that in a minute. And this is why Putin takes the presidency relatively young and inexperienced. So we've seen Pyrrhus represents Putin, but if we understand end from beginning, who else does Putin represent? Stalin. Based on our understanding of the beginning showing the end, Pyrrhus is Putin, Putin is Stalin. It's fascinating that the secular commentators, even those that were loyal to Putin, who draw comparisons between Putin and Stalin, and I want to look at some of the parallels between these two men. One Soviet and Russian military leader is one of my sources, and he does all this from a positive perspective, saying that history has been cruel to Stalin, that he was a good guy. And even he, Konstantin Petrov, marks these similarities to show how Stalin and Putin are so similar. Prior to Putin, the rulers before him, Yeltsin, Gorbachev, the ones before them, they'd come from relatively wealthy Kulak families, the Kulaks being the wealthy peasant class. Putin didn't, and neither did Stalin. So, Stalin was raised in extreme poverty. His father was an alcoholic shoemaker. They lived in 9 rented properties over 10 years. He was also heavily abusive and violent. Stalin's mother fled her husband and worked as a laundress to support herself and Stalin. Putin was raised in communal housing in the slums of Leningrad. His first job was hunting rats in the stairwells of the apartment. These communal housing apartments shared all the same facilities, and their most intimate living quarters were separated by cardboard. The history of his family before is fascinating. I think it was his grandmother who went through the siege, I think it was of Leningrad. And the history of what these people went through, the percentage of that city that died, and she's so weakened that they took her and threw her in with the dead bodies, not knowing she was still alive, where she laid for days till crawling her way out. So Putin comes from a family of fighters and survivors, but through awful, awful history. Stalin was part of the ground force, foot soldier, at the beginning of the USSR. He undertook paramilitary campaigns, he robbed banks to fund the Bolshevik Revolution. He was really just a foot soldier. Putin, foot soldier, part of the ground force at the end of the USSR, as a member of the KGB. Both at the time, comparatively to those around them, unimportant positions. Stalin was a Bolshevik operative. He organised strikes, paramilitary operations. He's reported to have robbed a number of banks, killed quite a lot of people, anything to support the Bolshevik Revolution. Putin stationed in Dresden, Germany during 1989, during the fall of the Soviet Union. It's interesting, he's called that fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So when you think of the millions that died and the geopolitical disasters that occurred from the beginning of the 1900s through to the year 2000, I find that quite a statement into Putin's mind, that he thinks nothing compared to the fall of the Soviet Union. Stalin became part of the communist government in 1917, pretty much just with the Bolshevik Revolution. And how he did this was pretty much by gaining favour of the leadership. Lenin appointed Stalin to the post of General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1922. So Lenin appointed him. This is not an important sounding position, General Secretary. But this is the only position Stalin ever held. He never graduated beyond General Secretary. All he did was make that position as Secretary the most powerful, important one in the Soviet Union. So you can argue that Lenin placed him in power by giving him this position. By 1929, about 7 years later, he'd defeated every last rival and either killed them or banished them. Putin, almost identical, entered local politics in 1991, moved to Moscow in 1996 to enter state politics. 3 years later, in 1999, Boris Yeltsin appoints him first Prime Minister, then at his resignation, appoints him as President. So Yeltsin appointed. Just like Stalin had to spend those first few years suppressing rivals, Putin steps into a government that is not all that powerful to begin with. Partly is because of the elite, the billionaire oligarchs that are now the most powerful people inside of Russia. He quickly, during the early year 2000, as he's running for that first election, he very quickly makes a deal with the oligarchs and works on bringing them under control, something that now he has done completely successfully. If you hear that a Russian oligarch is doing something that is business or personal or political, you know that Putin is behind it. It's interesting, there was one oligarch, a billionaire, who was dating Putin's daughter. No, they were married. He married Putin's daughter. They broke up earlier this year. It appears that he had an affair. Suddenly, out of nowhere, his wealth halved. Absolutely halved. No one knows why. Everyone knows that his wealth his stocks, everything cut by half. You don't cross Putin. They're saying it's lucky he's just alive. They have a similar method, and this is particularly what Konstantin Petrov noted between the two men. So this is someone who sees both of them very favourably, is that they rule similarly. Both maintain a higher understanding than anyone else in their team. They don't follow a plan, a written script by advisors, anything. Anyone else in the Russian government is of a lower understanding on any particular issue than Vladimir Putin. Stalin ruled the same way. So they always are above their advisors. And it's one thing that makes him very unpredictable. The other thing noted by Konstantin Petrov is both are bound by what is formed in the life of the society. And this is something that I find particularly interesting in the argument about whether or not Russia is still communist. Both are bound by what is formed in the life of the society. So Stalin, it's argued that he was not faithful to Lenin or Marxist theology, but to be a dictator, that is what he had to use to maintain control of the people, to imply that all he was doing was following the path set out by Lenin. To stay in power, Putin must follow what is formed in the life of this society. Now it is the appearance of democracy and loyalty to particularly the Orthodox Church and institutions. So he must appear to run as president, whether or not that means anything or not. He must appear to have an Orthodox spiritual life, whether or not he does. They are bound by what is formed in the life of the society. There are conspiracy theories which I try to avoid about Putin's early life, and some of them are a little bit plausible about how he grew up, whether or not he was adopted. I just want to note that if that conspiracy theory is true, that he was adopted, his early life is almost identical to Stalin's. Both where they grew up, their parentage, all of those things take not a completely identical, but the parallels become a whole lot closer. And both starting out by undertaking war in Chechnya also, which was Stalin's first work. So if we can note particularly that Pyrrhus is Putin and Putin is Stalin, who is Pyrrhus also? Pyrrhus is also Stalin. What I want to do then is pretty much map the Soviet Union, not from its birth like Pyrrhus, but from the time it enters global politics. Where it enters the world stage. So Stalin spent the first years of his rule consolidating power. And this was a long process, as the only position he was ever given was that of General Secretary. It was an interesting interview earlier this year where Putin justified Stalin's policies and said that those policies were necessary because of the external threats that Stalin had been facing, that the Soviet Union faced in this time. And then he named the two threats: the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany and the Spanish Civil War. Both have one common thread, and that is the rise of fascism. So a little bit of context. World War I, like the Third Diadochi War, ended in a peace treaty. You have this period of peace before the exact same players go at it again. I have looked at the Third Diadochi War, and really for time, not because I don't believe that it can be done, I absolutely believe it can be done, but I know that in those Diadochi Wars you will find the First World War. The parallels are too similar. So the third ends with a peace treaty. You have this period of peace before the second or the fourth war begins. That 1919 Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to take responsibility for World War I, to pay heavy reparations to the Allies. And like many Germans, Adolf Hitler felt that this was unfair. So with the loss of World War I, you have a great loss of national pride and living conditions. I want to note 1929 in this history. '29 is a real turning point. In 1928, Hitler came in ninth with 2.6% of the vote and only 14 of 491 seats in the Reichstag. 1929 comes, and with it comes the Great Depression. Germany, in the years previously, had been having trouble making their reparation payments to France and Britain that they'd agreed under the Treaty of Versailles. And to remedy this, under the Dawes Plan, America loaned Germany a huge amount of money. But when the stock market crashed in 1929, America wanted their loans repaid. This put a huge strain on what was left of the German economy. This final hit, after a 10-year loss of prosperity and national pride, was exactly what the Nazi propaganda machine needed. So if you note Hitler's rise in just a couple of years, in 1928 he comes in ninth with 2.6% of the vote, 14 of 491 seats of the Reichstag. The next year he comes in second. He goes from ninth to second, not 14 seats but 107 seats and 18.25% of the vote. 1932, couple of years later, he comes in as winner with 230 seats, 37.27% of the vote, and January of the next year he is appointed Chancellor. 27th of February, the Reichstag fire occurs, and he uses that as an excuse to nullify civil liberties and pretty much place himself as dictator. So his meteoric rise comes in 1929 with the Great Depression. And it's really that economic situation that they were able to use. 1929, Stalin defeats his last opponent and achieves absolute power. It's also his 50th birthday. The press began to virtually deify him, and that's when he really starts building this cult of personality. 1929 is the Lateran Treaty. In exchange for this treaty with the Vatican agreed to disband the Catholic Centre Party in Italy. So also in 1929, the last democratic party opposing Mussolini voluntarily disbands. So you can place Mussolini, Hitler and Stalin all in 1929. And the Catholic Church referred to Mussolini as their new Constantine. This, it's just worth noting, this was the agreement that the Catholic Church was making at that time, and it's what they did with Hitler a few years later, was dissolve the Catholic Centre Party. It was pretty much the last democratic stronghold against these dictatorships in Europe, both in Germany and in Italy, and to pass their code of canon law, this church law that they developed. They went into alliance with these nations, agreeing to disband any Catholic opposition, and that's one of a few reasons that they say that the papacy helped place Hitler. The Vatican itself wasn't afraid to disband these Catholic centre parties because they were independent to Vatican control. So if they're not taking their orders from the Pope, they're virtually useless to the Vatican. In fact, they wanted them gone because they supported policies, and it just wasn't the top-down structure that they were looking for, even though they were Catholic. What I particularly want to mark in this history, though, is the Spanish Civil War, which occurs from 1936 to 1939. In the early 1930s, Joseph Stalin was deeply concerned about the spread of fascism in Europe. So to counteract the growing power of Hitler and Mussolini, he encouraged the formation of left-wing governments. And this is what the Spanish Civil War was pretty much all about. It was a titanic struggle between communism and fascism, and who was going to take Spain. This was when, on the back of a government change, one president was ousted and a left-wing, communist-leaning president was placed in May of 1936. And soon afterwards, Spanish army officers began plotting to overthrow the government, those Spanish army officers soon being led by General Franco. So this Spanish Civil War breaks out in July of 1936, 17th of July 1936. France quickly called on all the countries of Europe not to intervene in this Spanish Civil War. In September of 1936, France drew up a non-intervention agreement which was signed, agreed to by 27 countries, including Germany, Italy and the Soviet Union. None of them held to that non-intervention agreement. Mussolini begins to give aid to General Franco and his nationalist forces, and during the first 3 months of that non-intervention agreement sent 90 Italian aircraft, refitted the cruiser Canaris, which was their largest ship. And on the 28th of November, the Italian government signed a secret treaty with the Spanish nationalists. So Mussolini takes the side of the generals, General Franco, who was fascist-leaning. Adolf Hitler also continued to give aid to Franco, but he disguised this by sending men, planes, tanks and ammunition all through Portugal and into Spain. Joseph Stalin now became concerned that Franco would defeat the Republican government, and he took the view that another fascist state in Europe would pose a threat. So Stalin becomes involved, and this descended into a proxy war. Spartacus education, Soviet Union and the Spanish Civil War. The Soviet Union provided considerable help to the Spanish Communist Party to improve its position in the Popular Front government. The Soviet Union were the main suppliers of military aid to the Republican Party. This included 1,000 aircraft, 900 tanks, 1,500 artillery pieces, 300 armoured cars, 15,000 machine guns, 30,000 automatic firearms, 30,000 mortars, 500,000 riles and 30,000 tons of ammunition. The Soviets expected the Republicans to pay for these military supplies in gold. On the outbreak of the war, Spain had the world's 4th largest reserves of gold. During the war, approximately $500 million worth, or 2/3 of Spain's gold reserves were shipped to the Soviet Union in that 3-year period. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 39 is remembered today as a sort of Second World War in training, a playoff game between the championship match between Team Axis and Team Allies. This was the proxy war that was the Spanish Civil War. And it ended on the 1st of April 1939. Franco defeating the Republican government, another fascist state was formed. It's interesting that the role that the Catholic Church also played in this, in opposing communism, they became heavily involved in the Spanish Civil War as well. And around this time, they're also working closer and closer with Hitler in Germany. It's interesting that the Pope was quick to point out during the Spanish Civil War, to point people to it, to say how much worse things could be under Bolshevism than under fascism. And this was the theme of a 3-hour conversation between Cardinal Fulhaber of Munich and Adolf Hitler at the Führer's mountain retreat in November. Hitler harped continually on the dangers of communism, imploring the Cardinal to persevere with efforts towards conciliation with the Nazi government. Cardinal Fulhaber observed, "The Führer commands the diplomatic and social forms better than a born sovereign. Without doubt, the Chancellor lives in faith in God. He recognizes Christianity as the foundation of Western culture. Not as clear is his conception of the Catholic Church as a God-established institution." That is Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell, page 180. As soon as the Civil War began, the Spanish hierarchy and the Vatican took an open and bold stand for Franco, the Spanish Catholic hierarchy, and unleashed all the power of the Catholic Church against their Republican government. The clergy of Spain became virtual combatants, and it was described by the Vatican as a holy war to save Spain from the Marxist hordes. So Hitler, Mussolini, Franco and the Vatican were on the same side in the Spanish Civil War. And after the defeat of the Spanish Republican forces, Franco established himself as a Catholic dictator in 1939. Pius XII stated that God should be thanked for once more the hand of divine providence has manifested itself over Spain. Should be noted the tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people Franco killed in that Spanish Civil War, including Catholics and priests and nuns. And after that, in fact, after World War II ended, while Franco was still in power, Spanish Catholics would gather at the Vatican under that porch area where the Pope comes out, and after the Pope addressed the people, they would shout, "Spain for the Pope," and the Pope would shout, "And the Pope is for Spain." But as we noted, this civil war ended in April of 1939, and there had been this huge struggle between fascism and communism, between Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin. So what took the world by complete and total shock and surprise was when these two ideological enemies, on the 23rd of August, 4 months later, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Towards this time in 1939, but just before this, Germany had annexed Austria and a border area of Czechoslovakia, and Britain and France had up till then tolerated his aggression. But then he made a territorial demand on Poland in the spring of 1939, and it became clear that France and Britain would not tolerate any more of Hitler's aggression. Further annexations would mean war in the West for Hitler. So Germany and France made a pact with Poland. These three nations came together to sign a pact to guarantee the integrity of Polish territory. If Hitler touched Poland, it would be war. Understanding in this history with Hitler's aggression, he knows that he's instigating war with the West. So the last thing he can afford is to then have war in the East at the very beginning of his campaign. This forces him to recognise that the only hope is to go into an alliance with one of his enemies. And he does that in August with Stalin. So Hitler knows he's facing war on the West and he cannot fight a two-front war just yet. Stalin, who is in less of a hurry, this is a book by Timothy Snyder, Stalin and Europe, Imitation and Domination, says Stalin, who was in less of a hurry, chose to keep Hitler waiting until the outcome of a major offensive against Japan in the Soviet-Japanese border war. By the 22nd of August, the Red Army's victory was assured. The next evening, the German Foreign Minister, Ribbentrop, was in Moscow for negotiations with the Russian Foreign Minister, Molotov. Those negotiations ended in a 10-year non-aggression pact, and this pact is signed. They meet just before midnight, they're negotiating over midnight, it's signed just after midnight. Included in the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was a secret protocol by which Poland, Romania and the Baltic states would be divided into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Each power was free to seize its share without receiving repercussions from the other. Thus, ideological enemies became political and military allies. Hitler no longer had to fear a prolonged two-front war. Against both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht, the Polish army had no chance. Hitler felt confident that the campaign in Poland would be over before the British and French could intervene in the West. Stalin could be certain that war in the West was indeed inevitable. Both dictators had achieved their aims. So we can understand what Hitler got from this, but what did Stalin get from this pact? What Stalin got was by supporting Hitler, he's driving him into a war with the West. He's actually weakening his enemy by going into an alliance with him. That is why Stalin made every effort to prolong that war as long as he could. So the two forces of socialism and Soviet Bolshevism were now aligned, having only just fought against each other de facto, aiding opposing sides in the Spanish Civil War. As a Russian revolutionary writer and exile, Victor Sergei would assert, the midnight of the century had arrived. 9 days later, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. So there were two parts to this pact. One was a 10-year non-aggression treaty. And the other one was secret, and it was the division of Europe, redrawing the map of Europe into two spheres of influence. This is an interesting article in the Los Angeles Times. This is August 19 of 1989. See, until 1989, the Soviet Union was never willing to admit that this pact existed, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. And one of the reasons they always denied it was to admit that this pact existed would to admit that their claims over Eastern Europe, over those Soviet satellite states, had their basis in a pact with Hitler. And they never wanted to admit to that. The Los Angeles Times, August 19 of 1989. Reversing decades of Kremlin denials, a senior Politburo member, Friday, conceded for the first time that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under dictator Joseph Stalin signed a secret pact on the eve of World War II that cleared the way for the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states. But Alexander Yakovlev, while arguing that the secret protocol to the 1939 non-aggression accord should be unequivocally condemned, denied that it had any legal impact on the Baltic states' current status as members of the Soviet Federation. Although he dismissed the nationalistic claims of the Baltic states, Yakovlev nevertheless broke new ground when he conceded to Pravda, quote, "There was, without doubt, a collusion between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany." I want to note the pact as occurring at midnight. So what was the effect of this pact on the world stage? I'm going to read a quote from The Devil's Alliance, Hitler's Pact with Stalin, Chapter 2. The week preceding those opening salvos had had an oppressive tenor. Although the precise details of the pact remained opaque, most contemporary commentators agreed that it marked an unprecedented shift. "It is a stunning blow," Romanian diarist Mihail Sebastian wrote. "The whole course of world politics has suddenly changed with that pact." Moreover, there was a grim consensus that the pact was more than just another chapter in Europe's ongoing crisis and most likely heralded war. Thus the world statesmen urged circumspection. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent Hitler a personal appeal suggesting alternative methods in solving the crisis. French Premier Edouard Daladier followed suit, urging the German dictator to step back from the brink. Otherwise, quote, "destruction and barbarism will be the real victors." British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, meanwhile, was disconsolate, confiding to the US ambassador that the futility of it all is the thing that is frightful. Britain began preparing for the worst. London's museums began evacuating their treasures to the countryside. Hospitals were cleared of non-essential cases, and railway stations installed blue lights to comply with the expected blackout. Everywhere sandbags were filled and stacked and windows were taped, while Chamberlain prepared to move into the central war room, newly completed beneath Whitehall. Orders were prepared for the evacuation of children from Britain's towns and cities to begin on the morning of September 1. The public mood was dark. "Poor, weary world," one diarist wrote, "what a mess we people have made of it." This is the world's reaction. While the world digested the news of the Nazi-Soviet pact and considered the prospect of war, Ribbentrop had travelled back to Germany with his entourage to a rapturous reception from Hitler, who hailed his returning foreign minister as a second Bismarck. There's one other aspect of this pact that I want to note, and it's a much less glamorous one than what we usually mention. The pact's primary motive was to enable Hitler to invade Poland and instigate war with the West. That for him would have been suicide at the very beginning of his campaign. And I agree that this was necessary to prevent a two-front war, but a less attention-grabbing reason, a little more dull, but I would suggest a just as important reason, was his economic situation. When Hitler came to power, the economic ties between the Soviet Union and Germany did weaken initially as Hitler implemented economic policies trying to improve the self-sufficiency of his nation, which is necessary in the event of war. It became apparent that Germany would not be able to be economically independent, so he instigated a trade relationship with the Soviet Union. This history is best described in the book Feeding the German Eagle by Edward Eriksson, which shows how Hitler had no other option than to rely on Soviet imports to begin his war effort. So 4 days before this pact is signed, they had concluded a German-Soviet commercial agreement, August 19. For him to undertake war, Hitler could only supply 25% of his oil needs, leaving Germany 2 million tonnes short a year. During peace, 10 million tonnes a year short to reach planned mobilisation totals. The problem was similar with all types of metals and metal ores. Also, Hitler needed to use Soviet-Russian lines to bring in his chrome, molybdenum, different metals from Turkey and China. This became particularly essential after the Western Front War began and British started blockading German trade routes. And many countries began to refuse to interact with Germany in trade. Without Soviet imports, German stocks would have run out in several key products by October of 1941, only 3.5 months into Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany would have already run through their stocks of rubber and grain before the first day of the invasion, were it not for Soviet imports. In fact, in 1941, when Hitler invades the Soviet Union, he's marching over the border of those satellite states at the same time as the Nazi army is crossing into the Soviet Union. They are passing trains, yet unaware that an invasion is taking place, heading back to Germany with all of the oil, the metal ores, everything to fund his war. So they essentially supplied Hitler with everything he needed to fight them. In exchange for all of these, it was pretty much German technology, the building plans for the Bismarck, the ship the Bismarck. All of these kind of German inventions were to be handed over to the Soviet Union, pretty much like infrastructure, new types of aircraft. So this pact was designed to enable Hitler to, on the 1st of September 1931, invade Poland. And he's taking on a threefold power at this stage. The Allies were France, Britain, and Poland. 3 allies versus Germany, who is backed by Russia. And then after that, you have this division of territory of Eastern Europe. They've redrawn the map of Europe and they divide it into 2 spheres of influence. And then one by one begin taking down those countries. Their relationship is strained by that division as smaller points of what part of what countries, what railroads they're allowed to use. It causes a certain amount of tension. And also noting that the main reason that Stalin is supporting this war effort to begin with is that he wants to weaken Hitler so much so that when the West is weakened, when Hitler is weakened by war, he'll be strong enough to just step in and take all of it. So in August of 1940, it began to look like this war was winding down, and Stalin gets worried that with Hitler taking France so easily, if Hitler's just going to win this war, that he's actually strengthened his enemy, not weakened him. So he starts to back out. Also, Germany has fallen way behind on paying for the supplies that they were buying from the Soviet Union. Hitler was stalling on sending the building plans for the Bismarck and all those different aspects of German infrastructure because he knew that he would eventually end up fighting Stalin, and the less he had to pay before that date, the happier he was. So August of 1940, Stalin suspends all exports to Germany. This was economic. And Trade is suspended. It's suspended for 1 month before they manage to negotiate their way out of it. Stalin sees a few other things that were happening in the West at that time. He sees that Hitler is still facing a prolonged war and he's more than happy then to help that continue. Around this time, just tying back to our study of Fatima, we understood the 25 years from 1773 to 1798. 1773 they stop fulfilling their job function, what they've been told by Satan to do. 1798 they're scattered. 1916 they're gathered. 25 years after that they begin to fulfill their job function. That is 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. So keep in your mind that when we discuss this history, we're discussing the first attempt on the Soviet Union, not just by Hitler, but also by the Vatican. And around this time, when war with the Soviet Union began to look more and more likely, what Pope Pius XII did was begin an international promotional campaign for Fatima. And he spread Eastern Europe with those papers. Books and pamphlets written on the experience of the Portuguese children at Fatima, advertised as historic fact, may count in part for the foreign legions from Spain, Portugal, France and Belgium, which fought side by side with the Nazis when they invaded Russia in 1941. The superstitious Catholic masses rallied in medieval fashion to the anti-communist banner. That is the article of the Vatican Towards Communism by Levi Morris Terrell. From the election of Roosevelt in 1936, the Vatican also attempted to establish diplomatic relations with the United States. I'd like to suggest what you have here is a Vatican trying to pick a beast. The US is looking less and less likely. The reason for this, Cardinal Gasperi arrived in New York to kind of fish out the US's approach, and he spent 3 days with Archbishop Spellman. What they were trying to see was if they could open a diplomatic relationship with the United States. Hitler had started off good in the early 1930s, 1933, signing this pact with the Vatican, but coming up to this history, the beast has started bucking. It's not a very good beast. In fact, when around that history, 1939, 1938, he in one of his speeches, he said that every time the Vatican tried to push itself into the political sphere, he was going to push it right back into its appropriate sphere, which was purely church, not state. He was refusing to allow the church to dictate to the state. And when he invaded the Soviet Union, the Vatican approached him with a plan by which they were hoping to follow his invasion with a second invasion of priests and lead to a mass Catholic conversion of Eastern Europe. Hitler's response was the day that he allowed the Catholic Church to undertake this enterprise in Eastern Europe would be the day that he allowed every single religion to do the exact same thing so that they could, quote, beat each other to death with their crucifixes. So his attitude toward the Vatican increasingly over this period, as he no longer found a need for them, was increasingly hostile. So there is kind of this area where they're also fishing out how the United States is looking. Problem, September 3 of 1939, the date that Britain and France declare war on Germany. President Roosevelt wrote to Pope Pius XII and he said, "I believe that the survival of Russia, communism, is less dangerous to religion, to the church as such, and to humanity in general than would be the survival of the German form of dictatorship." And this is where they split. This is where they disagree, and the Vatican and the US in this history cannot align, because to Roosevelt and the United States it's Hitler that needs taking down, whereas for the Catholic Church it is communism and Soviet Russia. Over this time, Hitler starts developing this plan. Really what he had wanted from the very beginning, from when he wrote his autobiography Mein Kampf, was that he saw that the East as the region where the Germans would find living space, and pretty much set up this new society. So he'd always intended to take down Russia. It was just kind of a matter of time. And he decides that instead of buying supplies from Russia, if he can just defeat the Soviet Union he can just take those supplies for himself. And this leads to his invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. Getting a little tight. Operation Barbarossa. You have the beginning of war in the West and then the beginning of war in the East. 1941 to 1945. You can also mark in this period the Holocaust. I know that it began previously, but in a truly awful history, with now war on two fronts, Hitler is no longer interested in just concentration camps and having to staff these places. And what he brings into use in 1941, invented and used, was the gas chambers. Now it's just wholesale massacring. War in the East. And you just have the wholesale slaughter of tens of thousands of hundreds, millions of people between the Soviet Union and Russia. It's not a history that was easy reading. So Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf had spoke of the necessity for living space, particularly in Eastern Europe and particularly Russia. He envisaged setting Germans there, building up this master race while exterminating or deporting most of the existing inhabitants to Siberia and using the remainder as slave labour. As early as 1917, he had referred to the Russians as inferior, believing that the Bolshevik Revolution had put the Jews in power over the mass of Slavs, who were, in Hitler's opinion, incapable of ruling themselves, but instead being ruled by Jewish masters. His army officers told their troops to target people who were described as Jewish Bolshevik subhumans, the Mongol hordes, the Asiatic flood, the Red Beast. What Hitler never did was separate the Jews from communism, and this is where also the ideology of the Vatican also aligned with Hitler. They were writing during the school years of Pope Pius XII. He had Catholic education, and then as he was training for the priesthood, around that time, papal endorsed Vatican authors were putting out in their Vatican newsletters blaming the Jews for the French Revolution. So what the Vatican blamed the Jews for was both the French Revolution, the revolutions across Europe, and the Jewish Revolution. So for the Vatican and Pope Pius XII, the Jews were responsible for the deadly wound, responsible for 1798, responsible for the Soviet Union and communism. They never separated that, and that is the same thing that Hitler did. I think someone told me recently that Marx was a Jew, and so were the Robespierre. I think that was suggested, but I'd have to double check.
Jewish mothers.
Jewish mothers.
And hereditary comes through the mother.
Okay. All right. So there is some truth that there was a lot of Jews in the Bolshevik forces, but one of the reasons for that is the fact that they'd already been suffering such heavy persecution. It's interesting with this invasion, the change that went over the Russian attitude changed towards religion. On August 21 of 1941, the Moscow radio called upon all God-loving inhabitants of the occupied countries to rise in defense of their religious freedom. This is Stalin's communist Russia, who's just shut down every form of religion inside the Soviet Union. It charged the German regime with menacing the very existence of Christianity and seeking the overthrow of Christ the King, to install instead the myth of the 20th century of Alfred Rosenberg. This was in response to Hitler's benevolent attitude toward the Russian Orthodox Church. So both sides go from being hostile to religion to pretty much using religion, allying with it for their own causes. So over this period, if they're going to say that Russia isn't communist because communist is anti-religion, they were not anti-religion on the 22nd of June 1941 or throughout that the Eastern Front of World War II. In response to this, Stalin returned much of what he'd taken from the Orthodox Church, and it stood patriotically behind Stalin in this war. Stalin rewarded its loyalty by discontinuing the publication of anti-religious journals, reducing the heavy taxes on the churches, and prohibiting violence against religion. German bishops in 1942 declared a victory over Bolshevism would be equivalent to the triumph of the teaching of Jesus over that of the infidels. So very much through that history still supporting Nazi Germany. And in 1945, Russia joins the Allies, the Soviet Union joins the Allied forces. Germany is defeated, and Europe is divided into East and West, marking the beginning of a Cold War. And we'll go into that history tomorrow morning. I think we're out of time. If you would kneel with me, we'll pray. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for this new day. Thank you for the sun as it comes over, Lord, and breath and life, the opportunity to study in freedom. Thank you for your histories and your word. Thank you, Lord, that you are preparing us to do this work. Lord, I pray that I just place each head bowed in your hands, and I pray you'll grant us wisdom, insights, Lord, into what's coming, that we might know not only what is happening now, what is happening in the future, also understand our past history. Thank you, Lord, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.